Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Monica Turner, and I'm a data scientist on the Predictive Analytics team at the Center for Humanitarian Data. It's my pleasure to be hosting this event to discuss the application of flood forecasting to anticipatory action. This event is the third in our series of public deep dives on the use of predictive modelings in the humanitarian space. Please note that this event is being recorded and the recording will be made available along with the slides after the event. Next slide, please. Let me begin by introducing our panel of speakers. First, we have Sela Nevo, who is a senior software engineer at Google. Sela specializes in machine learning research and development and heads the Google Flood Forecasting Initiative. His research focuses on integrating machine learning models with physics-based models in data-constrained, real-world problems. Next, we will hear from Dr. Liz Stevens. Liz is an associate professor in climate risk and resilience at the University of Reading and a joint science lead for anticipatory action at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Liz works at the intersection of research and practice in the development of early warning systems and their use by humanitarian practitioners. And then we have Madhav Upreti, who is a technical advisor and Asia-Pacific focal point for the Climate Center. By training, he is a hydrologist with extensive experience working on risk reduction, early warning systems, and resilience building for climate-related disasters in Asia. And finally, Dr. Amadul Hassan is a technical advisor for forecast-based financing at the Climate Center. He is a widely published expert in the fields of water resource planning, early warning, disaster management, climate change, vulnerability assessment, and resource modeling. Next slide, please. Next, allow me to briefly go over the agenda for the event. I will begin by giving a little bit of background to motivate the talks, after which we will have our four speakers give presentations of 10 to 15 minutes each. First, Stella will provide an introduction to flood forecasting, after which Liz will describe the challenges of integrating flood modeling into humanitarian response. This will be followed by two presentations outlining real applications of flood forecasting used in anticipatory action in different contexts. Madhav will discuss the work he has done on anticipatory action in Nepal, and Hassan will talk about flood modeling in Bangladesh. Following these presentations, we will have a panel discussion where the speakers will be answering questions. Audience members are invited to submit their own questions during the presentations through the WebEx chat tool. We hope to hear from you during the presentations. Before we get started, let me provide some context to situate the audience. The Center for Humanitarian Data is part of UN OCHA, and our mission is to increase the use and impact of data in humanitarian response. A large part of our work at the center involves providing analytical support towards the development of UN OCHA anticipatory action frameworks. Next slide, please. Next, I will briefly explain the concept of anticipatory action for those who are hearing the term for the first time. In traditional humanitarian response, aid is provided only after a shock or disaster has occurred, which means that many people have already been impacted by the time the aid arrives. On the other hand, anticipatory action employs forecasts to predict the shock, and based on the shock risk, the response can begin ahead of the crisis to mitigate impact. Emerging evidence shows that anticipatory action is a more dignified, rapid, and cost-effective approach. Next slide, please. Why is it crucial to apply anticipatory action to flooding? Floods are in fact the most common type of natural disaster. To put some numbers to that, an average of 163 flooding events per year occur, and over the last 20 years, 1.65 billion people have been affected by flooding. Unfortunately, the proportion of the global population exposed to floods is only expected to increase. With that, I'd like to hand the floor over to Sela Nevo, who will be giving us an overview of flood models and forecasting.
Thank you, Monica. And hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here, and thank you so much for having me. What I want to do over the next 15 minutes is give you a whirlwind tour of flood forecasting and flood models for non-modelers. So the idea here will be to focus on what is useful to know for someone wanting to use these models, but try to give you an understanding of broadly what they do and how they work. Next slide. So General principles before we deep dive into the actual models. The first thing to understand, which I'm sure any of you who have worked with flood forecasts before, is that different basins are different. And things like basin size and climate and so on can be very meaningful in the question of what we can and cannot forecast at what lead times and so on. There are often lots of trade-offs between different things that we want. So for example, if we're doing forecasts for a longer lead time, that might have a cost in terms of accuracy. So if you're using flood forecasting models, I'd highly recommend trying to ask what trade-offs are you making and what costs are you paying. So for example, if you're increasing the lead time, what does that mean about the data that you'll need to provide or the accuracy that you'll end up getting? The last thing I want to talk about before I move on to flood forecasts in a bit more depth is just to highlight that there's a difference between different terms that you see here at the bottom of the slide that depend on the timing that we're looking at. At the longest timelines, we often ask, what is the flood hazard? So for example, over the next 10 years, what areas are likely to flood and how severe will that flood be? Flood forecasts usually refer to more short-term forecasts, usually on the order of magnitude between hours and weeks. And then finally, flood mapping, or sometimes rapid flood mapping, can often refer to when we're trying to map a flood that already occurred or is ongoing right now. In this talk, I'll focus primarily on flood forecasts, though also happy to answer questions that relate to the other types. It's also worth noting that my experience is primarily in riverine flood forecasting, let's say as opposed to flash flood forecasting and coastal floods and so on. So my focus in this talk might be biased by that experience. At a very high level, flood forecasting systems can be thought of as three main components. The first is hydrologic models that tell us what will happen within the river. The second is our inundation models, which can then tell us how, once a flood occurs, it'll affect the floodplain, the areas outside of the river. And then finally, once we have that information, we can distribute that to whatever stakeholders need to know this information, whether that's governmental organizations, international organizations, NGOs, or directly to the individuals themselves. In this talk, I'll be focusing only on the first two, and we'll leave the warning distribution aspects to the other speakers. Next slide. Let's start with the hydrologic model. The hydrologic model accepts inputs, things like precipitation, temperature, basin size, previous stream gauge measurements, which I'll talk a bit more in a second, and so on. It needs to understand what the condition is throughout the basin, and then it produces as an output a forecast for either discharge, which is the volume of water going through the river per second, or of water level, which is the height of the water throughout the river. Next slide. Now, I want to present at a very high level two approaches for this kind of work. The first is the classic approach. These are physics-based models, or rather conceptual models, which implement the different components of the hydrologic cycle. Each one has its own kind of conceptual mini-model, and together they aim to provide what is really a kind of simplistic version of the model of the basin itself. Several things to note about this classic approach. So first, this is by far the most common and also kind of the most well-established method of hydrologic modeling. It has a history of over 40 years, and it's kind of the standard way in which these models are done. They have, I think that's one of its biggest advantages. I think that hydromet agencies and others are used to these models, and they're often easier to deploy with the expertise that already exists in organizations. Next slide. The second kind of high-level category that I just want to highlight is the machine learning-based approach. And as you can hear from my introduction, you can tell which one I'm personally more excited about. But just to try and kind of mention what I think are the upsides and downsides, I think those who have been following the academic literature in recent years will have noticed that these models perform better on large-scale benchmarks. Anything that includes hundreds or more of basins and gauges, these models have been consistently producing better accuracy. And they've also shown really unprecedented results in trying to forecast in ungauged basins as well. But all the things that I mentioned before about the advantages of classic models are really the disadvantages of these. They can be more challenging for organizations that already have certain types of expertise to deploy, monitor, maintain, and so on. I mentioned that the forecast is for, let's say in this case, water level, what the height is. Another important output of these models is the uncertainty that they provide. So all models are uncertain. We never know with certainty what will happen. And these models are no exception. Preferably, these models will also produce a range that they're unsure of what the water level will be. So here in this slide, you can kind of see this kind of band of light blue color, which tells you what is the range of uncertainty, let's say between the 10th percentile and 90th percentile. In this case, that means that there's an 80% chance that the true water level value will end up being between the top end and the bottom end of this strip. And this kind of dark blue line that you're seeing, which most people often look only at that, is only our best guess, right? So that's the most likely outcome, but really any outcome along this strip is possible. And that's extremely important because sometimes if that margin is wide, that really means we're not 100% sure what's going to happen, and we do need to be prepared for the range of possibilities rather than just the best guess estimate. Next slide. I quickly want to highlight that these models require not only work on the modeling itself, but there's a lot of work around operations and deployment to make these models useful. So one is the latency at which we can aggregate data is incredibly important. For example, if our model relies on measurements from stream gauges, which is what you're seeing at the top right corner, an example of where we measure what the height of the water in the river is right now, if that takes 6 or 7 hours from when the data is collected to when that is aggregated and brought to the model to be used, that means that we lose about 6 or 7 hours of the lead time, of the forecast time that's useful. And if this is a short-term forecast, for example, with only, let's say, 3 or 4 hours of lead time, this might make our forecast useless. These models can often be sensitive to errors in the input data. And in fact, I think in real-world operations, often a larger portion of the errors from these models come from getting bad inputs more than they actually make mistakes. This is at least true in kind of larger, slower moving rivers. And so being able to detect errors and correct them at an early stage of the process is very important. The frequency at which you can run these models is also important, because if your model has a lead time of 12 hours, but you run it only every 24 hours, that again will make it so that most of the time you don't know what will happen in 12 hours, because maybe you've only run the model 18 hours ago, for example. And then finally, there's often some need for monitoring of real-time errors to make sure that, especially if we're relying on this model for real-world decision-making, that's an important component of the process. Slide. So a few notes about what you should expect from the outputs of a hydrological model. So I kind of quickly mentioned this earlier, but the lead time is usually between several hours and 2 weeks. This is bounded quite strongly by the accuracy of weather and precipitation forecasts. And what lead time is feasible really depends on 3 things listed here. Mostly on how flashy or quickly reacting the basin is. Secondly, on how good the weather forecast is. And thirdly, on how good the hydrologic model is. Of course, can depend on other things, but I think these are 3 critical components. The forecast accuracy can also range quite a bit. Anywhere between, I think, reasonable things to expect, depending on the situation, can be between centimeters of error and meters of error. Broadly speaking, if you have centimeters of error, that means you know extremely well what's going to happen. Usually, people are not very sensitive to an error of several centimeters in the water level. But an error of meters in the water level really means you don't know what's going to happen, but you can sometimes still get out of that kind of the shape of what's going to happen, the trend. Will things continue to rise? Are they likely to peak anytime soon? And things like that. The most critical factor in the size of your errors, in addition to the things I've mentioned already in the first bullet point, is whether you have in situ measurement availability. So whether you have stream gauges or other type of measurement on the ground and can use that as an input to your forecast, because that can significantly improve the quality of your forecasts. Finally, I just want to mention that even if you have only a hydrologic model, which means that you only know what the discharge is going to be or the water level is going to be, you can still use this without the next component that I'm about to present by setting a threshold for action. Right? So if you have, for example, you say when the water level reaches such and such height, that means areas are going to be flooded and we need to deploy some action. Okay, let's move on to the next model. And that's, one note about calibration and validation, and that is usually these models, if you have a stream gauge, are extremely easy to calibrate and validate. If you don't, though, it's hard to both calibrate and it's also unlikely to get very accurate results. You'll be more on the meter side likely than the centimeter side. Okay. Let's move on to the inundation model. This model takes as an input what's going on in the river in the area you care about, whether that's discharge or water level, and produces as an output a map of the inundation extent, and if possible, also the inundation depth. Next slide. These are usually calibrated. This model is broadly, you can describe how it works in the following way. First, you need to generate elevation maps, which are very important to this model. You also need a forecast or a measurement for discharge or water level. You then run these models alongside other inputs I won't get into right now, and it produces the map that I described a moment ago. Next. Elevation maps are incredibly critical. What you're seeing now is actually the same location. This is a river in Hyderabad with the same amount of water, but simulated with elevation maps at different resolutions. And you can see that on the left, we're getting very inaccurate results just because we have a lower resolution elevation map. So this is an incredibly important input. Next slide. The classic way of generating these models is what's called hydraulic models. These are physics-based models, and they require a lot of data. We need a good elevation map. We need to know the river bathymetry. But their upside is that if we can provide all of that data, they can be extremely accurate. So if you're capable of running these in a reliable way, I'd recommend that. Next slide, you can see here kind of a conceptual visualization of what these models do. They separate things into pixels and then kind of use time intervals and time steps to fill them out, but we won't get into how they work more than that with the time we have. Next slide. There's a long list of other possible inundation models. This used to not be the case. It used to be that inundation modeling was pretty much the same thing as a hydraulic modeling. I won't have time to get into them, but I did want to just mention that there's today other ways of doing inundation modeling. Next slide. Things you can expect from inundation model outputs. So one is, it's important to note that usually they don't provide additional lead time. They rely on the lead time of your hydrologic model. Their real value is in producing spatial information, knowing what areas are going to be affected and the severity of different areas across the floodplain. So that's really the value that these kinds of models provide. And their accuracy can also range quite a bit between tens of meters, which is extremely accurate, to being wrong to many kilometers. And really the most important thing for their accuracy is whether they've actually been calibrated and validated based on past flood maps, which is not obvious at all. Many of these are deployed without being calibrated in this way, and usually they are inaccurate when that is the case. Next slide.
Oh, Sela, let me jump in and remind you of 1 minute left. Thanks.
Thank you. So to validate them, we usually use, there's different ways, but the most scalable and easy way is using satellite imagery. And here you can see an example of such a validation. You can see where the model was right in blue, where the model said there would be flood, but there wasn't in yellow, and where it didn't identify that there will be flood and wasn't in red. Next slide. And here you can see an example of validating this model in the real world. You can see a flood map in red on the phone, and you can see that the blue dot is standing right at the edge. This is an example of this model working well where we can see that exactly where the model says the flood will end is indeed where it ends. Next slide. Okay, and finally, when we have all of these, we can provide an actionable forecast, right? We can know what areas are going to be affected, who needs to be informed, whether that's the public or relevant agencies, and we can tell them exactly where they need to go or where they need to beware to be safe. Next slide. And so to conclude, kind of these three components that we've deep dived into the first two are the general components of what creates a good flood forecasting system. And yeah, very happy to answer questions later if people have some.
Thank you so much, Sela. I just want to take this moment to remind the audience that you can submit your questions either by using the Q&A menu or the chat. And next, we'll have Dr. Liz Stevens to tell us about integrating flood models into humanitarian response.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for inviting me to present today. So my name's Liz Stevens. I work for the University of Reading, but also the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre, and today I'm presenting with my University of Reading hat on. Over to the next slide. So I'm going to be presenting work that's part of the FATHOM project, Forecast for Anticipatory Humanitarian Action, and forecast and work that's funded under the SHEAR research programme. Next slide. So when it comes to the use of humanitarian forecasts, there are a number of different forecasting systems out there. And as the Daily Mail here have in this article, we really need to find some way to avoid this 80% chance of confusion when it comes to deciding which forecast to use. Now, obviously, working within the humanitarian sector, we want to make sure that the forecast used is robust and that it triggers far enough in advance to take the actions that we want to take. But this is often very resource intensive. So if we want to take action a couple of weeks in advance of a flood, that usually requires coupling a hydrological model with a meteorological model, and that's very expensive in terms of computational resources. We also need to be able to ensure that those forecasts are robust. So we need to have archives of historical forecasts which we can evaluate. Again, they are computationally expensive, and the places that tend to do that are able to use supercomputer resources. However, we really want to be able to strengthen the local capacity as well, respect the local mandates for warnings and ensure sustainability of the system to make sure that there's no contradicting messages, and to make sure that into the future we are developing what is being done in country and on the ground, and not just relying on humanitarian systems. At Reading, we work together with the National Hydromet Services to integrate global forecasts, like from the Copernicus Emergency Management Services, GLOFASS, the Global Flood Awareness System, and integrate that forecast into the existing systems and practices. So in Bangladesh, it's being integrated to provide an extended lead time of forecasting to the Flood Forecasting and Warning Centre in Bangladesh. And in Uganda, it's being used as an interim solution while their forecasting capacity is under development. So next slide. So I'm going to focus today in this presentation in how we can tell if the forecasts are robust. Now, as I mentioned, I work with the Global Flood Awareness System. It's freely accessible. You just need to sign up. And if you go onto the web interface, you can see that there is an assessment of forecast skill that's available. Now, when we've looked at that forecast skill assessment, and I've shown it here on the left, and compared it to our own decision relevant skill assessment, we can actually see some quite large differences. And if we had ended up relying on the left-hand assessment, we would have actually ended up using the GLOFASS system in parts of Uganda where it wasn't in fact robust. So what is really important is that we consider doing a decision relevant skill assessment and not just using the off-the-shelf products. On to the next slide. So how should we be evaluating the forecasts? Well, the first thing to think about is coming up with a list of all of the different decisions that are going to be made in a country to support vulnerable people. So in this example here, there's a list of decisions for the Brahmaputra River in Bangladesh, which was worked on by Sazat Hussain, who is a joint PhD researcher between Reading and FFWC. And I've just highlighted two decisions here, so you can see the sort of different things that we're thinking about. The first one would be evacuation of livestock to a safe place. We would need to do that if we think a flood is going to reach the 99th percentile in terms of the river level. And we would need to take those actions at 4 days lead time. In contrast, we might be looking at sort of internal decisions within the government agencies, so communication for early flood preparedness, perhaps preparing for evacuations to take place at shorter lead times. This kind of activity would need to be done if we think there's going to be a flood that's going to exceed the 95th percentile, and we'd need a much longer lead time, so 10 days in this example. Next slide. But what we've realised is that we need to consider certain aspects that are beyond that. And we're sort of terming these the acceptability criteria when it comes to a forecast. So we're thinking about the false alarm ratios, so the number of times that or the percentage of times that we're happy to take action, but the flood not actually occur, and also the probability of detection as well. So the percentage of floods that we are actually able to forecast. And when it comes to those shorter lead time actions, like the evacuation of livestock, we need that false alarm ratio to be quite low, and we need that probability of detection to be quite high. We certainly don't want to be encouraging people to evacuate if there isn't a large chance of a flood occurring, because they might then not evacuate in future, and I think that that's one of our concerns. However, when it comes to the decisions in terms of that early communication for flood preparedness and management from the government agencies, we can be a little bit more relaxed in terms of our acceptability criteria. We're quite happy if we act in vain half of the time. We're quite happy if it only picks up half of the events. And we can also think as well about that certain actions that we're taking have an acceptable delay associated with them. So, for example, if you are taking decisions as a humanitarian organisation and distributing aid, you're not particularly bothered if the flood arrives 10 days later than predicted, because actually that's still an effective action. However, if you were to evacuate livestock and the flood not arrive for 10 days, then that's quite a long period of time where people are having to feed their livestock from their own pocket. Okay, on to the next slide. So when we stick this together, we can evaluate the forecast for all of these different criteria. And in this example, you can see that from the Global Flood Awareness System, the forecast for the decision of evacuating livestock is not good enough. So for all of the different forecast probabilities that we've assessed, none of them lie within that grey box. Whereas for the communication for flood preparedness, actually it does lie within that grey box, so we would be happy to use the GLOFASS forecast for that particular decision. On to the next slide. However, what I've shown just then is what we can do in a setting where we have river gauge data, we have lots of information on the impacts, but what can we really do in data poor settings? And of course, many parts of the world don't have river gauge data, so we can't assess forecast skill using that, and we have to use something else. Now, another PhD researcher at Reading, Faith Matthew, has been working on what happens if we evaluate the flood forecasts using impact data sets. So we all know that impact data sets like MDAT, Desinventar have their own uncertainties with them, but what kind of effect does that have if we want to be able to assess how robust the forecast is? And she has worked to do a skill assessment for some Kenyan and Ugandan rivers, and the skill assessment has been run using the impact observations as well as that river gauge data. And what we can see in that right-hand diagram is the difference in the probability of detection. And for these rivers, on average, that probability of detection is assessed as lower when using the impact data sets. So what that means is that we might end up throwing out a forecast because it's not good enough, even if in real life it would actually be good enough if we were using the traditional gauge data to do the evaluation. However, there are actually not massive differences, which suggests that if we want to have some confidence or develop some confidence in the use of forecasts, we can use impact data sets as long as we do so with some caution. The next slide. So there are also situations as well where we haven't verified the models, but we are really under some pressure to be able to use them in times of imminent crisis. And we've been undertaking some work with some other partners as well, including ECMWF and the University of Bristol, to produce flood forecast bulletins for FCDO when there are events forecasted that are expected to have a large humanitarian impact. So, for example, for Tropical Cyclone Idai in 2019 and Batsarai only a few weeks ago. And what we've done through experience is developed tips and tricks for giving us confidence in the global flood awareness system and in knowing what we can and can't say from the forecast. And that is based on expert knowledge from the GLOFAST development team on what the GLOFAST behaviour is in particular settings, as well as work on tropical cyclone predictability. And we also use forecast archives to draw comparisons with previous forecasts as well. And if anyone's interested, I can provide some more detail and a sort of list of criteria that we use. And from that, we have developed a careful use of terminology and phrasing which can help us navigate the uncertainty in those forecasts. And some of you might have received those flood forecast bulletins through FCDO for certain events. Next slide. So in summary, I think it's very important that the forecasts used by humanitarian organisations are robust. We don't want to be spending money unnecessarily when it could be used more effectively elsewhere. I would be very cautious about using any kind of off-the-shelf assessment of forecast skill because I think it's unlikely to provide something that's usable for our decisions. And we really need to make sure we consider the decision-making context, not just in terms of the lead times and the thresholds that we might want to trigger the humanitarian action, but also the criteria for forecast skill. And I think we have to be very careful, especially of evacuating people, for example, when we know that the false alarm ratio is quite high, because in the future that could have enormous implications. So alternative data sources may be helpful in the data poor settings, but please use that information with caution, and perhaps you can contact Faith for more information on that. And again, if anyone wants some further information on how to use the GLOFAST model in an unverified kind of way, then please get in touch again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that very interesting presentation. Next, we'll have Madhabu Preti tell us about applying anticipatory action in Nepal.
Thank you, Monica. So hi, everyone. So this is Madhav Preti, working as a technical advisor and the Asia Pacific Regional Lead for Climate Center. So today, basically, in my presentation, I wanted to share you a bit around what Red Cross has been doing, particularly in Nepal, in terms of the designing of the anticipatory mechanism and at the same time implementing it by using the available flood forecast data and the model. So basically in my presentation, I just cover, give you a bit of context, the flooding context in Nepal in particular, and then a bit on how exactly, like what kind of impacts we are prioritizing in order to kind of minimize those through the different early actions, and also the flood models, like what kind of flood models, the forecast sources that we are using. And I'll also quickly reflect back on the recent flood that we had in 2021, because it has a kind of huge learnings, particularly for the anticipation communities in Nepal. Next slide, please. So in terms of the areas that we are particularly focusing in Nepal are the two rivers mainly, and these rivers are on the western part of the country. So one we have the Karnali and another we have the Babai, and these two rivers are completely different in the terms of how they kind of respond to the rainfall and how the extent of flooding is. So Karnali is a kind of snow-fed river. It's a big river. It has a big catchments. It's a transboundary river as well. Whereas a Babai river is a mediocre river. So, and it originates from the middle mountains, and it has really a kind of this short response time, given that it's originating, it has a very short stretch, and at the same time the watershed itself, the catchment itself is quite less. So in terms of the floodplains that we are targeting are the two districts, and these are basically downstream of these two rivers, and in terms of the municipalities, the flood exposed municipalities that we are covering are the 5 municipalities, and in total the households that that are exposed to these floods, particularly the flood from these 2 rivers, are it's around like 32,000 households, and looking at the flooding context across these houses, it's not just these the riverine floodings that have been posing issues in these areas, but actually there are also this the issue of the flash floods, because there are a lot of small rivers that originates in these areas. So that is what we are currently targeting, the region in itself. So next slide, please. In terms of the flood history in these rivers, yes, we have seen quite a bit of the flood events in the past, and also the tendency of getting these high flows, I think is a bit increasing as well. And normally, like we have this there is like this danger level and warning level set by the local met agencies, the DHM, Department of Hydrology and Meteorology of Nepal. So usually the warning level, they kind of set it as a 2 return period flow, whereas the danger level, it's around like 5 return periods. So that has been a bit of the general approach that the met agencies has been taking. So next slide, please. So in terms of the impacts, basically we have been observing in these floodplains are obviously one more on the loss of lives as well, and also the displacement of the people. Also the houses have been destroyed and damaged in the past. Also there's a huge kind of effect in the livelihoods, particularly the croplands and also the livestock. And also there has been a lot of disruption in the critical services. And the import, like it is really critical for us to understand the different types of impacts, because accordingly we can then look into, okay, which impacts basically we need to prioritize or we need to kind of address through the early action. So particularly the highlighted ones are those which we are prioritizing currently, and this is through the set of early action. So these are like early warning messaging. That's something we have there, and also like building this temporary flood shelters, and also like doing some of this household strengthening, and yeah, like giving some supplies regarding these hygiene kits, or some of these wash materials, and also the evacuation of the livestock, in particular, like by constructing of these temporary sets, and also like management of these livestock feeds, and yeah, also supplying some ready to eat food for those who are kind of early evacuated. So that has been the kind of set of early actions. And in particular, next slide, please. In particular, obviously there is already this set thresholds, like the from the national met agencies in terms of warning level and danger level. But what we have seen, particularly when we try to correlate with the actual impacts, it has been seen, like it has been found that, particularly for the Bowai River, though we have this danger level, but in terms of the impacts, like the significant impacts that we will start to observe only, it is more than the kind of like 1 meter from the set danger level, and for the Karnali, like so far we have seen, like we have observed, the danger level is something we start to observe really extreme impacts, and that's how we have kind of set our impact threshold. Particularly is the thresholds where which will define we need to kind of intervene like before the event, like if the forecast is kind of telling. Next slide, please. So in terms of the trigger mechanism, so I already mentioned the reason that we are targeting is not only affected by the riverine floods. It's also the local floods, the flash floods from these small rivers. So this is why we also wanted to kind of capture these different kind of flood types. So obviously we have the Karnali flood, we have the Bowai, and also some of these the flash floods. Obviously, the monitoring of flash flood is a bit tricky, but at the same time, yes, I think it's also something we can't really avoid, because the same area, the same houses are kind of affected by this different kind of flooding. So that's why we are kind of within our trigger mechanism, we are kind of trying to address these different both type of floods. And in terms of the forecast source, so obviously hydrological models are something we we are using, but at the same time also the meteorological forecast also something we are considering, and this is particularly because there is like a lot of the local effect, the local dynamics we do see when we kind of have these different extreme rainfall events in these river basins or even in the downstream areas. So in terms of the readiness part, so particularly time for the preparation as such, the minimum we have, like the ideal is to 3 days to the maximum to 7 days, whereas for the activation part, particularly where we really need to kind of activate our actions, it is like around like 24 to 48 hours, and it's mainly guided by the way how the forecast is available. So which is I'm going to explain the next slide, please. So in terms of the forecast, particularly, so one, as already highlighted by Lise, we are considering the GLOFAS because this is the only source that is available if we are considering for a larger lead time, and that is the one of the main strength the GLOFAS has. But in terms of the challenges, I think we do feel there are a lot of issues with the GLOFAS, particularly in context of Nepal, and like particularly when we are kind of looking at these really high flows, the flows that are more than 2-year written period flows, we are getting really high false alarm ratios for Karnali. For Bombay, I think the forecast skill is really bad. And also there is a kind of tendency we have seen, particularly with these GLOFAS in Nepal context, is very inconsistent signal. The signal is quite inconsistent, and also there are at times where we are missing the events, and also there are at times we are really kind of the over predicting. So there is a kind of issues, and it's also because the way the flood basically happens in Nepal, because there is a lot of these high mountains, and we have a lot of this orographic effect, the local effect, which particularly these different global models kind of fail to capture. So that's the kind of challenges we have. But still, I think we are considering is to use as a readiness trigger, given that it has a bit of lead time. But the crucial part for us, or the crucial basis for our activation, is the flood forecast that is available from the DHM, from the national made agencies, because they do run the models, and these models are mainly for the major rivers, but we do have that for our target river basins, and the lead time is available at around 72 hours. But looking at the accuracy of it, it's hardly kind of like we can rely on it as a 24 to 36 hours only. So that is what we have seen. So and the other issue is it's internal, so it's not publicly available. So there is an issue with the timely access to all these. And there is other models as well, and this is from the EC mode, and this is also something we are considering for that. Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry, Madhav, I just need to jump in. You only have a few seconds left, so if you could please wrap up.
I just quick wrap up. So I think maybe we can skip this part. And I'll just kind of quickly reflect on the 2021 October flooding, and this was the flood that happened like after the monsoon was withdrawal from the country, and in this case particularly the GLOFAS in particular couldn't kind of give any signals even like a day before the event actually happened, and that was also the similar case from the local department as well. They were kind of expecting a huge rainfall events, but the way the scale and intensity of it and also relating it with the flooding event in these rivers was not kind of forecasted. We only kind of got a sense of the signals like for 12 to 18 hours ahead with some model from the EC mode, and that's like the way we have kind of designed the trigger mechanism. I think we really couldn't kind of follow through that. So we have very less lead time to really act. And at the end, I think we end up having just the 12 hours to really act. And with that, we just kind of target the early action that relating to early warning messaging and some this early evacuation. And this is something particularly in Nepal, the anticipant communities need to prepare for. So you can't really kind of get a long lead time, particularly the way these different catchments operate, like the response to different rainfall. And also the global forecast as such also has some issues with the way they predict. So that's all I think I might went over a bit of time, but yeah, that's all from my side. I'm happy to have get some questions at the end. Thanks. Over to you, Monica.
Thank you so much, Madhav. It's a very interesting presentation. And last but not least, we have Hassan to tell us about the application of anticipatory action in Bangladesh.
Yes, thank you very much. Allow me to speak on behalf of Climate Center, the experience of what we have using flood forecasting model and getting benefits. What are the benefits? What is the learning, the application of these models? Go to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk about 4 major areas. Why we are talking about, which area, and what is our target. Second, I want to talk about from the history, from the learning from the past, what are the impacts, what is our plan for early actions plan, anticipated plan based on the forecast. Finally, third, we like to talk about which models we are using, what are the strength and weakness of these models when we are using the model for anticipated actions. And also talk about some highlights of what we have done in flood 2020 in Bangladesh, that are going to talk about some of the learnings, what we have done using this model. Next slide. The area is a Brahmaputra River basin, but we are talking about within the Bangladesh that we call it Jamuna. Jamuna River Basin, which is consists of 11 districts, and about 26 million people are living there. And 25%, approximately 25% peoples are below poverty line, highly vulnerable because of regularly these areas goes underwater and people really suffer. So that is our target areas, and approximately highly vulnerable peoples in these areas is about 2 million peoples in the area. Is a highly dynamic area, and the model we are using, I'm going to talk about next. Next slide, please. So looking at the impacts on this area, this 11 district, 6 districts is highly vulnerable and the rest 5 is moderately vulnerable. Based on the forecast of information in the past, we see the impacts, mainly the loss of life and livelihood. And we also look at it, the crisis of the fodder, and also we found that during the flood, the movement was restricted, that they have a problem, and the security also some extent because of security from because the water is everywhere, very difficult to protect their assets, and health issues are there. There are spread of diarrhea and other diseases in that area. But one of the things, looking at it, what is possible based on the limited lead time, what we have from the model, we come up with a cash grant can be a plan for as a response to reduce the impacts, and that the cash grants and for the anticipatory actions can reduce the loss of asset. They can save it, move it, evacuate, as well as they are forced to sell the asset with the very low price. With the cash, at least they can save their valuable assets, and also the access to the food, which is most important for them to purchase. So we provide plan is unconditional cash grant. One, the trigger is reached based on the model we have used. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yes. In Bangladesh, for the Jamuna floodplain, we use 2 models. Mainly the 2 models. There are many models, but mainly 2 models. Why 2 models? We need more lead time to take the actions, but we don't get 15 days or 10 days type of where the scale is high. That's why we use pre-activation trigger model, which is we use GLOFAS, so that we can get time to get ready in the field. But it is pretty good in the 10 to 15 days lead time. It gives reasonable accuracy for that area. I will come to that later. Second one is activation trigger. When we act our anticipatory action based on national models, which is run by the Flood Forecasting Warning Center, and which has a 5 days lead time. So we have activation trigger and pre-activation trigger. We use global model, a knowledge model, a hydrological model, probabilistic model with a 10 days to 15 days lead time. Actually, the lead time is 30 days, but we use 10 days in 2020. And we like to propose in future 15 days too. So, and 5 days lead time with deterministic model of FAWC that we used. Go to the next one, sir. Next. Yes, here what we face using the GLOFAS model for experience, what we have, we look at it. We saw that the model give us time to get ready in the field. So readiness, this model is give us also the trend or tendency of upstream river, which actually major inputs to our flood forecasting warning center model. The trends is also the GLOFAS model trends flood go up or down. That tendency used by FAWC, that is very good, that they have advanced information, getting the model run much with a better boundary data. This is manual data, not physical interface. Another important is GLOFAS is give us the flexibility of the readiness. Even it has less accurate, but for readiness purpose is good enough to invest that readiness money with the GLOFAS forecast. This is important. The challenge what we face is there are three options because we have a pre-activation and activation. So pre-activation trigger reach but may not reach activation. And pre-activation, without pre-activation reach, we can have an activation, and both can hold. These are the three options. We found that 40% time that we have pre-activation and activation. So 60% time can go other options. This is one limitations. So a second one, which we thought is very important, is the forecast. The lead time is enough for readiness, but we cannot use GLOFAS as activation model for activate the early. Skill is not high enough. We have that is important, and we also see the flashy rivers like Tista areas, which actually one of the rivers contribute the Jamuna River. Forecast is not great. That is also important. And the river is calibrated almost 100 kilometers inside the Brahmaputra River from the border. No calibration points at the boundary of Jamuna River. That is also we found is lagging. We need if can calibrate better with the boundary data, it can be improved substantially. Next slides, please.
Hassan, let me jump in and say you have 1 minute left. Thank you.
What do you mean by that? Okay. Okay, so no problem. FAWC actually is a deterministic model, still struggling with more than 3 days lead time. 4 and 5, they do have problem, but 1 to 3 days lead time, they have very good forecast. And one of the things is important that government use their FAWC forecast, and also our national society has an MOU. That means demand is there to get the data and act before the event is happened. Go to the next one. Go to the next one. Yes, interventions in 2020, we flood. If you look at it, the scenarios that BDRCS means our national society in Bangladesh gave a cash grant to about more than 3,800 household, whereas WFP gave in July. In June, they gave 6,000, and July, they gave 23,000 by OCHA funding projects. So, and beside that, FAO and others also provide assistance to people in that Jamuna floodplain. Go to the next one. Go to the next one. Yes, most of the money has been used to procure food, food for them. Okay, next one. The recent evaluation, it shows that that the asset loss is less. People use it for evacuation and less borrowing money from the outside. Thank you. Next. You have 30 seconds. Yes, Monica, you're happy?
Yes, thank you so much, Hassan, for that very
But
interesting
a lot
talk.
of things I cannot talk because of a major important. People are using the model to reduce the risk. Still, there are challenges, but still useful. The model results for saving lives and livelihood in Bangladesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Hassan, and a huge thanks to all the speakers for those very interesting presentations. Also, thank you to the audience for submitting your questions. If we don't get to them in this panel discussion, we will reach out to you individually. So let's start with a question for Sala. You provided a wonderful overview of the current state of the art in flood forecasting, where your models draw from various data sources. An audience member asked, how would the use of open data exclusively limit or impact the performance of your models?
So I think generally this changes a lot from different regions and depending on the basin. There are some areas where I think, small basins where you have kind of flash flood swamps, sometimes open data that is globally available just isn't at a high enough resolution to provide a forecast there. And kind of much larger basins, this could be useful. I think whenever you use open data or in largely available data, you almost always take a significant hit to accuracy. That's kind of part of the trade-offs that I was mentioning before. And I think we just heard wonderful examples of this in Nepal and Bangladesh about how to use different models for different goals and kind of. So that would be my approach as well, which is to say to use exclusively open data when you have to, and for those things that you don't have other models to do. But yeah, there's definitely a price to be paid in accuracy when doing that.
Thanks so much. So our next question is for Liz. Your expertise lies at the intersection of flood modeling and humanitarian application. What could humanitarian teams working in flood vulnerable areas do to contribute to improving the performance of flood models?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we're trying very much to do that. I mean, in some ways, my post at Reading is a joint post between the two organisations to do this. I think it's really important that humanitarians feed back to the forecast developers on what is going right and what is going wrong, and by really feeding back as well in how these forecasting systems are being used, so at what lead times they're being used. What thresholds are important, then that means that the GLOFAST development team know what they're going to look out for when it comes to putting those scientific developments in place. I'd also say as well that we do need to improve our forecasts for ungauged basins and basins where the impact data is quite poor. The impact data sets, as I think someone else has mentioned in the chat, are not very good for this purpose. And when it comes to evaluating GLOFAST, we really need to know things like the precise location where the flood occurred and at what day the river peaked or something like that, to be able to evaluate what's going on in the model. So if the model gets the flood 10 days too late, we need to know that. We can look at that specifically. But currently, I guess in places like South Sudan, we just have something saying this region flooded in July, and that doesn't provide us with that information. So the humanitarian teams on the ground if you collect that information and can pass it back up to us, then that's really important, and we can feed that in. And I'd say that those conversations are already happening, and we've been in contact with MSF in South Sudan, who are already collecting that information and feeding it back to the team. So I think that's incredibly valuable.
Thanks so much, Liz. Our next question is for Madhab. So you gave a very interesting presentation on the application of flood forecasting to anticipatory action in Nepal using GLOFAST. Can you tell us a bit more about how you validated the GLOFAST forecast for this purpose?
So for particularly for the Karnali, we looked into few events basically, and try to kind of develop these false alarm ratios for that. So that was one approach, very simple approach. We tried to do that. We had few flood events and we do that. And another also we did the way which Liz was telling, to look into for the different return period flows, and also at different lead times. And what we have observed, particularly in context of Karnali River, was that even in the lead time, 1 or 2 days, I think it's not that much any difference with the way we are getting these false alarm ratios, even looking at the 7 days or as such. So that's how we have kind of evaluated, particularly for the for Karnali, and similar is also we are doing for other rivers as well in that. And as I already mentioned, I think this is a bit of tricky, particularly for Nepal context, to use the GLOFAST, and there are a lot of these different local effect which the GLOFAST kind of failed to predict or kind of capture. And that is what had happened in the 2020 flood. We didn't have any signals at all of that, but we had a huge flood in the western and the eastern part of the country. And this kind of tendency we will often see in future as well. And that's why we need to understand the dynamics of the flooding in Nepal before we really kind of rely on some particular models, even when it is from the global or the regional sources. So thanks.
Thank you. So we're a little bit over time, but we will try to squeeze in one last question for Hassan. So Hassan, you gave a great example of combining a global model with a forecast developed in country by the FFWC. So what advice do you have for humanitarians looking to engage with local Met offices in order to build their anticipatory action models?
First thing I want to say that the concept, the perception of the flood, the people, when it is expected, when it is not expected, unexpected, that is very important, where the thresholds are. From the people's perspective, in Bangladesh, some areas is 12 feet of water is normal. Some area, even 3 feet of water is not normal. When you're talking about the mapping in the water, some are expected. It's not flood. Is expected water. We want to enjoy that. And above the thresholds, this is the problem. So we have to use, when we're talking about, that is talk with the people in the community and attribute our product accordingly. This is my advice to the modeler. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So unfortunately, we are out of time, but we hope that the audience enjoyed the event and was able to learn something. So please expect future events in this series and sign up to the center mailing list if you haven't already. So thanks again so much to the speakers and to the audience, and we hope to see you next time. Bye.